My name is Jackson. My story began on an ordinary day in August when the sky was clear and the summer wind brought smells from nearby kitchens. I work as a night guard at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. By the way, the city ceased to be important a long time ago. Everything stopped here, resting from life. The composition is also no exception. That night, I arrived at work and immediately noticed that something was wrong. The silence was abnormal. Not the usual night silence, but some kind of intrusive, disturbing one. The warehouse was full of boxes and pallets, but that night everything looked different. I could feel the skin on my back starting to get covered in cold sweat. When I turned on the lantern, the light pierced the darkness and suddenly revealed something terrible. There were footprints on the floor leading deep into the warehouse, traces of blood. I was shaken with terror. Of course, I could decide that it was just laundry from one of the workers, but my intuition told me that it was not. I decided to follow the tracks. My hands were shaking, and something inside me roared with fear. I walked through the warehouse, and each step seemed louder than the previous one. With each step, the tracks became brighter and the fear deeper. Suddenly, I heard a noise, barely audible but completely clear. It was like a slow, almost ritualistic pressing of something heavy. My heart pounded in my temples and my breathing became shorter. I moved closer to the source of the sound and saw something that will stay with me forever. On the floor, in the darkness, I noticed scattered pieces of cloth, blood, and worst of all, a red trail leading to a dark room at the end of the warehouse. I froze and felt the air become heavy and oppressive. I knew it was too late to turn back. I opened the door of the room, and for the first time in my life, I saw something that made me believe in the horrors that I had only heard about in legends before. There, in the middle of the room, lay what was left of someone who might once have been human. Blood and guts were scattered everywhere, and the smell of death filled the space. Then I heard him, a whisper, deaf but clear, a whisper that said only one thing: "You're next." My heart was beating so fast I was afraid it would jump out of my chest. I stood there, motionless, listening to the whispers that merged with the quiet noise of the air in the room. I could not believe what I saw. Blood on the floor, torn pieces of cloth. It all looked like something out of the worst dreams. But it was reality. I took a few careful steps back, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly, the door I had left open slammed. I froze in fear, turning my head to the darkness of the corridor. The lights in the warehouse began to flicker. My breathing became irregular, and I tried to keep myself from panicking. The whispering continued, and now I could make out individual words. "You know what you've done." I didn't even know what to do next. I tried to contact the police, but my cell phone had no signal. It was like someone was trying to cut me off from the world. As I started to walk back to find the exit, I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I turned around and shadows began to dance on the walls. I thought someone was following me, but I couldn't see anything specific. I tried to stay calm and check all the locked doors and windows. Nothing seemed reliable. Random thoughts about what might happen to me flooded my mind. I remember feeling hopeless. I didn't know if I was going to be alive or not, and that was the most terrifying feeling of all. I decided to check out the old refrigerator in storage. Usually there was storage there, but this time it was empty. I began to look for items for self-defense. I found an old broken mount that could somehow protect me. After I armed myself, I tried to find a way out of this terrible place. The whispers grew louder again, and I felt the air in the room thicken. I walked through the corridors of the warehouse, trying to avoid the scattered pieces of tissue and blood. With each step, the fear grew, and the heart almost beat out of the chest. And then, when I finally reached the front door, I heard a voice behind me. It seemed that it was not a human voice, but something much worse. I turned and saw a shadow moving across the floor. My logic told me to run, and without hesitation, I rushed to the door. The door was closed, and I felt like time was trying to catch up with me. I was torn between the hope of salvation and the fear of what awaited me inside. I decided that I had to break out of this trap, even if it meant meeting the person who was hunting me. I couldn't find a way out. The warehouse was a maze, and each corridor seemed endless. My heart was pounding with fear, and I could feel every ounce of my will disappear. Suddenly, I heard the door open and close behind me. I looked around and saw something that will always stay with me. He was there, a man in a black cloak and mask. His eyes glowed from the darkness, and he was looking straight at me. I felt a cold sweat cover my body, and I took a few steps back. "You know what you know," he whispered, moving closer to me. I tried to leave the room, but the door was locked. I was trapped. Now my only hope was that I could find a way to get out of this place before it was too late. Every movement, every sound seemed ominous. I understood that any mistake I made could be my last. I panicked when I realized that the door was locked and there was no way to escape. The masked man was approaching. His steps sounded heavy and menacing. I peered into the darkness of the room, hoping to find something that could help me, but all I could see were the lights going out and a trail of blood trailing down the middle of the room. I tried to dispel fear and find a logical way out. However, every thought about a plan of action only increased my anxiety. I knew I had to act fast. It became clear to my mind that my salvation could not come until I decided how to survive here and now. "What are you waiting for?" came a man's voice that interrupted my thoughts. His voice was cold and calm, but there was something in it that made me shiver. I could feel him enjoying my fear. I turned around and started looking for another way. In one corner of the room, I noticed a metal pipe coming out of the wall. I decided that this might be my only chance for survival. I approached the pipe, trying to be as careful as possible, and tried to break down the door. However, it was in vain. I could feel my throat begin to constrict from the tension. The man came even closer. His movements were weightless and invisible. I could see him coming towards me, and my fears began to tangle into a nightmarish kaleidoscope. I tried to breathe calmly, but I could feel my hands shaking. Suddenly, I heard a loud roar. It must have been from behind the wall. I approached it and noticed that one of the tiles was loose. I started working on it, trying to get the tile out. After a few minutes of hard work, I managed to pull out the tile and see a narrow passage. The man was already close, and I heard his steps become clearer. I quickly crawled through the passage and found myself in a narrow corridor. It was tight and dark, but there was less chance of being found. I moved forward, trying to contain myself and not make a sound. After walking a few meters, I heard a sound that became even more terrifying. It was a sound that resembled screams in the distance. My heart began to beat even faster. I knew I had to find a way out while there was still a chance. The corridor was getting tighter and tighter, and I began to feel my breath catch. I walked further, deep into the darkness, and suddenly came across a metal door that led to another part of the warehouse. I pulled out a crowbar and broke the lock, hoping it would help me get free. I ended up in another room that was full of old equipment and boxes. It was empty and quiet. I decided to hide in one of the boxes until I could find a way out, or until I could decide what to do next. While I was sitting in the box, I heard someone walking by looking for me. I barely breathed, trying to remain invisible. The masked man seemed to be getting closer and closer, and his movements were becoming clearer. I felt like I was trapped with no way out. I knew that if I didn't find a way out soon, I would have nowhere to hide. I decided that it was necessary to act and find any possible way to salvation. I began to carefully climb out of the box, trying to be as quiet as possible. Suddenly, I heard the floor creak, a sound I couldn't ignore. I turned quickly and saw the door to the room open. I hoped it was the police, but only a man in a mask appeared. My fear peaked. I knew this was my last attempt. I grabbed the mount and hit the man. This gave me a few seconds to escape. I ran across the room and found a door that led outside. I broke them and jumped free, trembling with fear and fatigue. My freedom was close, but I knew it was just the beginning. The masked man is probably still around, and he won't leave me alone. I need to find a way to protect myself and get help before he finds me again. With each step, I felt my strength diminish. I was shivering from cold and fatigue, but my resolve remained steadfast. I headed to the nearest police station, hoping to get help. On the way, I tried to keep calm and plan what to do next. When I finally got to the police station, I was greeted by security who looked surprised and concerned about my appearance. I felt like I was on the verge of passing out, but I knew I had to tell them everything. I quickly explained what had happened, showed them the pieces of cloth left on me, and the traces of blood. The officers immediately realized the seriousness of the situation and began to act. I was taken to an interrogation room where I tried to describe in detail everything I saw. The police began to check the warehouse, and I remained waiting for news. Time seemed to drag on endlessly. I sat there, shaking with fear and exhaustion, trying to relax. Suddenly, one of the officers entered the room with a serious expression on his face. "We found several traces of blood in the warehouse, but we did not find any bodies or other evidence to support your story," he said. "We are currently searching the area, but unfortunately nothing concrete has been found yet." I was overcome with disappointment and hopelessness. I knew I had to find a way to protect myself, even if the police couldn't provide me with concrete evidence. I tried to go home, but the nights became more frightening and I felt my fear haunting me. That same evening, I tried to go back to my normal life, but the fear prevents me from sleeping. I heard disturbing sounds from behind the walls that resembled footsteps. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but every sound raised my anxiety again and again. In the morning, I received a call from the police. It turned out that traces of DNA were found in the warehouse, which can help in the investigation. It was the only thing that gave me hope that my fear made sense and that the police could help after all. I continued to watch my apartment and tried to be alert. My fear grew when I noticed that someone was following me again. I felt that someone could be watching my every move in the dark. The next day, I got news from the police that the masked man I saw still hadn't been found. They discovered that his tracks lead to an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. This place seemed perfect for him to hide. I decided I needed to learn more about this place. My curiosity and fear made me go there even though it might be dangerous. I tried to leave again in the warehouse. Again returned to the place where I was first driven by horrors. This time I walked with a much greater degree of caution. I noticed that the abandoned house looked like it had not been used for a long time. The windows were boarded up, the doors were locked, and there were only dead plants around. I could feel the fear coming over me again. I walked across the yard and found one of the side entrances. When I entered, an inexplicable silence enveloped me. I saw shadows moving on the walls, and my fears only grew. The interior of the house was full of old furniture and items that had not been used for a long time. I came across a room that looked like a laboratory. There were old tools and various devices. I found some photos and documents that seemed strange. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I looked around, but there was no one there. My anxiety increased again, and I began to look for any sign of the presence of the one I was so afraid of. I knew I had to find a way out and check these documents to understand who was behind this horror. I picked up one of the documents lying on the table. The lack of light in the room made it difficult to see, but I was still able to make out a few notes that pointed to various studies and experiments. I saw posts about projects that seemed to involve psychological manipulation and controlled behavioral modeling. Each document contained the name, Dr. Martins. I couldn't figure out what it all meant, but I had a feeling it might be the key to who was behind it all. Quite by accident, I found a few pictures of people I knew. It turned out that these were photographs of victims who had been chosen for some experiments. Suddenly, I heard a slight sound, as if someone came out of another room. My blood froze as I realized that someone might be around. I quickly hid the documents in the bag I found nearby and tried to find a place where I could hide. I heard someone approaching, and my heart beat in a rhythm of fear. I hid behind the old couch, trying not to make a sound. A few minutes later, I saw a shadow on the wall. It was the masked man I had seen earlier. He went to the laboratory, looked through the documents, and whispered something to himself. It became clear to me that he was looking for something specific, but did not know that I was here. I breathed softly, hoping he wouldn't find me. When the man finally came out, I knew this was my chance. I slowly got out from behind the sofa and rushed to the exit of the house. My fear and anxiety made me move faster. I broke out of the house and ran towards the nearest street. I knew I needed to contact the police immediately and give them the documents I found. This may be the only piece of evidence that will help solve all these terrible cases. I hurried to the nearest police station and gave the documents to the officers. The officer taking the documents examined them carefully and looked concerned. "This is very serious," he said. "We will investigate, but for now we need you to remain under protection." I realized that I should not go back home. I found temporary accommodation with friends and began to wait for news from the police. My life became anxious and filled with fear. A few days passed and the police began an investigation. I received several calls from a detective who was interested in my testimony. He asked about all the details that I remembered about the man in the mask and about the documents found. However, I learned that several people from my area had disappeared, and this caused new worries. I began to suspect that all of this might be part of something much bigger and scarier. One evening, as I was returning home from a visit to the police station, I noticed that my door was open. I felt a cold sweat cover my body again. I entered the apartment and saw that everything was turned upside down. My documents and personal belongings were scattered. My fear reached a new level. Someone clearly wanted me to stop looking for the truth. I didn't know if it was a threat from the same man or someone else, but I knew I had to act fast. I contacted the police but did not receive any concrete help. It turned out that the recordings from the surveillance cameras were destroyed or damaged. My hope for safety was gone again. I decided that it is necessary to go to the end and find out who is behind all this. I returned to the abandoned house hoping to find more evidence. My actions became more and more risky, but I realized that this might be the only way to get an answer. I returned to the abandoned house with a renewed sense of determination. Every step was difficult and filled with fear, but I knew that this was my last attempt to uncover the truth. I entered through the same side entrance I had used before. The feeling of anxiety was acute, but I concentrated on finding new evidence. I decided to check out all the rooms I hadn't checked yet and maybe find some new clues. In one of the rooms, I came across an old safe that was locked. I found some old hack tools that might help me. My hands were shaking as I began to work on the safe. After a few minutes of hard work, I managed to open it. Inside were numerous documents, photographs, and videotapes. I decided to check the videotapes first. In the dark, I was able to find an old video player and insert a cassette. An image of a laboratory appeared on the screen where a man in a mask was conducting experiments on people. I saw victims being strapped down and put through various mental tests. The records were terrible. I saw people screaming in pain and fear and realized that these experiments were part of a plan of control and manipulation. Dr. Martens was clearly responsible for these horrors. I found several more tapes that contained recordings of conversations between Dr. Martens and his colleagues. They discussed plans for the future and mentioned Project 13, which involved the use of psychic influence on new victims. From the documents, I learned that Dr. Martens was an experimenter who conducted his experiments on people who were randomly selected. It turned out that he was working under the cover of a large corporation that funded his research. I found the addresses and contact details of Martens' colleagues, which helped me understand who else might have been involved. I decided to contact the police again and give them all the materials I found. But again, the police could not help me properly because most of the evidence was not specific enough or could be distorted. At night, when I returned home, I noticed that someone was trying to get into my apartment again. I found tracks leading to my door and realized that my safety was once again in jeopardy. My nerves were on edge, but I couldn't stop myself. I decided to stay in the apartment and try to protect myself. I locked the doors and windows and tried to look for any signs of danger. Again, I heard these strange sounds behind the walls and began to worry. I didn't know if it was an infiltration attempt or just my imagination, but I had a feeling it might be something more. The investigation became more and more complicated. I began to learn more about Dr. Martens' motivation and his experiments. I discovered that he was trying to create a new form of human control that would allow him to manipulate the behavior of his victims and even control their thoughts. I decided to turn to experts in the field of psychology and forensics to get help in understanding how this could all work. It turned out that Dr. Martens was famous in his field, but his work was banned due to ethical violations. It turned out that the corporation that financed the work of Martens was powerful and influential. I started looking for more information about her activities and learned that she has many secrets. I decided to see if there was a connection between them and the experiments that Martens conducted. I started receiving anonymous threats trying to get me to stop. But I knew I had to continue the investigation, even if it meant putting my life in danger. I found an old shelter on the outskirts of town that I was told was used by the corporation to hide their experiments. This place looked perfect for hiding the last traces. I decided to test him, trying to be as careful as possible. The interior of the shelter was sad and gloomy. I came across old documents and records that confirmed that further experiments were carried out here. I found information about new victims and plans for the future. Suddenly, as I was going through the last documents, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see several masked men who were once again associated with Dr. Martens. They were closing in on me, and I realized that my life was in danger again. I tried to escape through the side exit, but they found my place and blocked the way. I had to act decisively again and look for another way to salvation. I knew that my only salvation was to find a quick and safe way out of the shelter. I ran desperately through the dark corridors, trying not to make any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the fear take over every part of my body. I found a small room with a window that was not locked. I tried to climb through it, but it was too small for me. When I was about to give up, I noticed that there was an old fan in the room that led out to the roof. I climbed up to the roof through the ventilation duct and realized that I had a chance to escape through the attic window. I made my way through a small structure and finally made my way down to the street. My breathing was heavy, but I knew I couldn't stop. I broke out of the shelter and tried to find a hiding place, but my pursuers were close. I could feel their gazes burning on my back and began looking for any place I could hide. I came across an abandoned house in an abandoned neighborhood. I quickly ran inside and closed the door. My breath hitched, but I remained alert, trying to hear any sounds from outside. A few hours later, I heard someone enter the house. I watched through the crack in the door and saw several masked men searching the premises. A new sense of dread came over me. I knew these people could be part of the group working with Dr. Martens. I decided to wait until the situation calmed down. However, even in this desolate place, I felt that my life was once again in danger. I tried to relax and come up with a plan for what to do next. Finally, when I heard that the pursuers had left the house, I decided to try to contact the police again. I used an old cell phone I found in the house and was able to call a detective I already knew. I told him about my pursuit and new findings. He promised to send help and invited me to a safe place. I knew I had to leave this house urgently before the pursuers returned. I left the abandoned house and went to the meeting place with the police. My nerves were on edge, but I understood that this was my chance for salvation. I arrived at a safe place and met with the detective. He confirmed that a new investigation would be conducted based on my latest testimony and documents. I hoped that this new evidence would help solve the mystery and lead to the arrest of Dr. Martens and his accomplices. I received new instructions from the police and went to a new temporary shelter. My fear and anxiety continued to haunt me, but I knew it was necessary for my salvation. I tried to remain calm and waited for further instructions, but I felt that even in this new, safe place, the danger had not gone away. I continued to receive threats, and every day my fears grew. I decided to find a way to influence the situation. I began to investigate the possibility of uncovering the connections between Dr. Martens and the corporation. I learned that there was an opportunity to pass information on to journalists who could help make these horrors public. I found the contacts of several well-known journalists and decided to contact them. I hoped that their influence would help bring those behind these crimes to justice. I handed over all the found documents and video recordings to the journalists. They were shocked and promised to investigate. I hoped it would help uncover the truth and stop Dr. Martens. Subsequently, the publication of articles and investigations began. People began to learn about the horrors that were happening and the corporation behind it. I received a lot of support from the public. Under pressure from the media and the public, the police launched a new operation to arrest Dr. Martens and his accomplices. I have received news that several people have been arrested and that the investigation is ongoing. I was relieved, but also knew it wasn't the end. I remained safe, waiting for the final results of the investigation and hoping that justice would be restored. Every day, the investigation became more intense. I have received news from journalists and the police that several people have been arrested and that a new investigation has been launched against the corporation. But with each new piece of information, I felt that the danger was not yet over. I stayed in touch with the detective, who promised to keep me updated. At the same time, my nights were full of fear and anxiety. I was sure that my peace could only be temporary. One day I woke up and saw on the news reports of major arrests at the corporation that funded Dr. Martin's experiments. I was surprised to learn that several high-ranking officials had been arrested and that rumors of corruption and malfeasance had been confirmed. Feeling somewhat relieved, I began to hope that justice would be restored, but the fear still remained. I knew that not all the details of the case had been revealed and that there might be other dangers. A detective contacted me to say that he had found new evidence that Dr. Martins was planning to escape. He indicated that during the investigation, several hidden documents were found which testify to the preparations for the escape and possible plans for new experiments. I realized that even after everything that happened, Dr. Martins could still be free and continue his crimes. This motivated me to act even more decisively. I have received several anonymous messages warning me that I have become a target for new threats. These messages were written in a scary and threatening tone, and I realized that the danger might be even closer than I thought. I contacted the detective and asked for additional security. He had arranged temporary security for me, but I knew it might not be enough. During the investigation, the police found several documents that indicated that Dr. Martins may have cooperated with other criminal groups. This made things more difficult, as not only his identity but also his potential support networks had to be revealed. I began to receive news that the investigation had become more complex and that additional time was needed to reveal all the details. My anxiety grew, and I continued to wait for further instructions. My fears were confirmed when, in the morning, I discovered that my temporary accommodation had been ransacked. Someone was going through my things and seemed to be looking for something specific. I was forced to urgently move to a new place, which was provided with security. I began to suspect that someone was trying to find out what I knew, and it might be part of a plan to destroy the evidence or even me. One day, while visiting my new safe apartment, I ran into a former colleague from university who worked in journalism. He asked about my well-being and offered to help. I shared some news and documents with him. He helped me find new sources of information and connections that could help the investigation. I began to feel that this new help could be very useful. My journalist colleague has uncovered new evidence that Dr. Martins may have had contacts with international criminal groups. This explained why the investigation was so difficult and why the threat was so great. I learned that Dr. Martins had an escape plan that included going abroad. This made things difficult as he could quickly disappear if not apprehended. Together with the detective, I began to develop a plan to capture Dr. Martins and his accomplices. We collected all available data and created a strategic plan for the operation. It was important to act quickly and precisely. My journalist colleague and the detective prepared the operation to ensure the detention without unnecessary risks to the public. I stayed in touch and helped coordinate activities. The operation was difficult and dangerous. We followed the trail of Dr. Martins and his accomplices who were preparing to escape. The police and special units were ready for any surprises. I watched the operation from a distance, knowing that the outcome could be decisive. The police searched and detained without incident. Dr. Martins and several of his accomplices were arrested. After the arrest of Dr. Martins and his accomplices, justice began to be restored. I felt relieved and satisfied that these terrible crimes had finally been stopped. The detective told me that all the documents and evidence I provided were key to solving this case. I knew that my struggle was not in vain. I started trying to rebuild my life after all the horrors I had experienced. My perception of reality changed, and I became more careful and conscious in my actions. I continued to communicate with the detective and the journalist, discussing the news and hopes for positive changes. I realized that my fight for justice helped not only me, but also many others. After the arrest of Dr. Martins and his accomplices, I finally began to feel that I could breathe freely again. My struggle with the darkness that had enveloped my life was over, and I could now focus on rebuilding my life. However, even after all that had happened, I felt that recovery would not be easy. My nights were filled with memories of the horrors I had experienced, but I also began to find solace in being able to share my story and help solve horrific crimes. I have been working to reintegrate into society and resume my normal routine. I decided to do something useful with my experience. After discussions with a detective and a journalist, I started working on a project that aimed to help victims of crime and raise awareness of security issues. It became a way for me not only to cope with my own experiences, but also to give something useful to society. My new acquaintances and support from the detective and journalist became important for me. I found new friends and support that helped me start to feel part of the world again. I learned that while horrors can leave scars, it's important to find ways to survive and move forward. Gradually, I recovered and tried to live a normal life. I continued my work and took care of myself, trying not to forget what I had learned and what I had experienced. My story became a part of my past, but I knew that the future still had many possibilities. Every day I felt stronger and able to cope with any challenges that might come my way. I knew that life could be unpredictable and difficult, but now I had new tools and strength to overcome any difficulties. My path to recovery and restoration of justice has become an important lesson in my life. And although I could not forget all the horrors I had experienced, I knew that it was important to move forward and find a new meaning in my life. Thus, my story is over, but its lessons and experiences will stay with me forever. I hope that my quest for justice and restoration will serve as an example to others and help overcome the darkness in our world.